Welcome back to our final episode in this unit on Greek history. I hear cheering in the background. Today we're going to be looking at Alexander the Great's final conquest, ultimately his death, and his legacy. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. We're looking at about 326 BC when we are starting this. Remember when we left off, Alexander had completed his conquest of Persia and had conquered the king Darius and was ready to move into India. He moved through what is today Afghanistan and through what is called the Khyber Pass and down to the Indus River Valley, part of India. And there he began to meet and to attack a different kind of army, an army that had not been cowed by his reputation, an armies that were supported by elephants, and armies that he had to fight in a different way than what he had fought before. In one of these battles against a king by the name of Porus, Alexander had to use a very clever means in order to try to engage the army because they were on the other side of the Indus River, which was a very wide river at this point, even perhaps a mile wide. And Alexander was going to have to cross that river and then immediately attack Porus. In order to get across, his men, who were wearing their armor and their weapons, would have to somehow swim, which you could imagine would be very tiring. So the men cut bundles of reeds and used those reeds to support them as they did a little kick swim across the river. Meanwhile, Alexander took his cavalry north and south of the river, ultimately building rafts, ferrying the horses across where the armies of Porus could not see them, and then riding the horses back up to attack Porus on his flanks just as the infantry was beginning to come out of the water. It was a difficult battle, but one that Alexander appreciated. And he appreciated the skill and the strategy that Porus had used in order to try to hold on to his kingdom. In fact, Alexander was so impressed with Porus that following the battle, he offered Porus the opportunity to become the governor of the kingdom that he had previously been the king of. Although that sounds a little bizarre, Alexander was quite willing to make enemies his friends if that would help him to secure the property or the territory which he had conquered. Now, shortly after this battle, Alexander was continuing to push east. But his soldiers were getting tired. They had been away from home for 8, 9 years. They wanted to see their wives. They wanted to see their children. They wanted to see their extended family. And so there came a day when his soldiers said, "We are done. We are going no further." It essentially was a mutiny where they refused to continue to march to the east. They said, "Look, every time we go over a hill, all we see is more land and more armies that we have to fight. We're not seeing the ocean." Alexander was very disappointed by this lack of what he saw as courage or gumption on the part of his soldiers. Nevertheless, he accepted their decision and told them that they would begin their way home, but that they were going to have to go down the Indus River rather than backtracking through the Khyber Pass. His soldiers continued to follow him, and in one attack on the way down the Indus River, Alexander was severely wounded with a wound in his chest that actually pierced his lung. This frightened his soldiers. They loved their commander, and they were concerned about him and worried for his life. So from that point on, Alexander was put onto a ship, and the ship floated slowly down the Indus River while most of his soldiers marched along the bank. Once he got down to the mouth of the Indus River, Alexander founded a city there, which he called Alexandria. It was the one of many cities that he founded that he called Alexandria. There was only one city that he named something different, and he called it Bucephala, after his horse Bucephalus. But he then told his soldiers that they needed to go through the Gedrosian desert. Now, the Gedrosian desert is just a terrible desert. Sand everywhere, heat everywhere, no landmarks. The wind doesn't allow for any roads or trails. And so the locals told him that going into the Gedrosian was basically a death sentence. Many people had gone out, but most of the people that went in died. He chose that route. Well, historians argue about why he chose that route, but one of the reasons why they believe that he chose that route is because no man had ever succeeded in bringing an army safely through that desert, and Alexander wanted to be the first. The results of this were fairly there was a catastrophe. Many people died. Now, lots and lots of animals died, women died, merchants died, and they were probably the majority of the victims, but many of the soldiers also died. There is a story that is told about this trek through the Gedrosian desert, where one day they are going along. There is hardly any water left in the camp. In fact, they can only find one water skin with any water in it. And the men, knowing that there's only this one skin of water, bring it to Alexander and say to him, "Sir, there's only one water skin left. We would like to give it to you." They then hand the water skin over to Alexander. He takes the skin, pulls the lid off of it, and pours the water out onto the sand and says, "If you do not drink, then I do not drink." Now, you can imagine that his men might be thinking, "Well, I would drink that. Why are you throwing that away?" But it appears from the stories that this really endeared him to his men, that he would suffer the same things that they would suffer, that he would not be pampered when they were suffering. And so this is something that actually brought his men closer to him in this time that was very difficult. Eventually, the army gets through the Gedrosian desert and make their way back to Babylon. At this time, he allows his men to rest. Many of them go home. Other new ones come, and Alexander begins the serious business of ruling the Persian Empire. However, after a relatively short time, Alexander, in the August of the year 325, gets sick. Starts out as a stomach ache. It gets worse. After 3 or 4 days, he's got a horrible fever. He's very weak. And after about 6 days, the rumors are going around in Babylon that Alexander has died. Of course, this is very demoralizing to his men and his army. And Alexander recognizes that he needs to do something to keep the morale up. So he requests that his bed be taken out to the balcony where he can be propped up, and then he orders his men to march past the palace so that he can wave to them, showing them that he is, in fact, alive. This does boost their morale. The men go away confident. However, after the parade, Alexander is taken back in to the sick room, and his commanders gather around him, and they plead with him, "Alexander, please, name an heir. Tell us who is going to rule your empire when you are gone." This was important because Alexander's only son was a very young boy, and they knew that he would never be able to hold the empire together. And so they wanted a clear direction as to which of them would be in control. Alexander is reputed to have said, "the strongest." And then he died. After his death, There was a great mausoleum built. It was an enormous structure put on wheels and was pulled by, said, up to 150 horses. This was supposed to carry Alexander's body back from Babylon all the way over to Pella in Macedonia, where he was going to be buried. However, with the death of Alexander and no clear direction as to who should inherit the empire, Alexander's empire began to dissolve. It just dissipated. Each of the little areas that were governed by a separate governor began to break off, and every governor was claiming that he was the one that was the strongest, just erupting into a series of civil wars. Porus broke off. He created a kingdom in India. Ptolemy broke off. He held a kingdom in Egypt. Macedonia broke off. Babylon broke off. There were just a lot of shattered pieces. And in fact, Ptolemy was so brash that as part of Alexander's, as his funeral cortege was moving towards Pella, Ptolemy came out of Egypt and captured Alexander's body, taking his body back to Alexandria in Egypt, where he was buried in a splendid mausoleum there in Alexandria. Now, Ptolemy did this because he believed that by having Alexander's body, it would give him a greater claim to the empire of Alexander. Now, ultimately, Alexander was his empire completely dissolved. His son was killed, and this great empire that Alexander had forged in only 10 years dissolved seemingly overnight. Really quite a tragedy and an act of futility. Now, following the death of Alexander, his fame continued to live on and continued to grow, and his influence was felt all throughout the world. So, for example, in Rome, there was a great political statesman by the name of Pompey who adopted the term Magnus, or epithet Magnus, which indicated the great. Obviously copying himself after Alexander. He even went so far as to have the same haircut which Alexander supposedly had as a way of trying to show the world, oh, look, I'm just like Alexander. Octavian Caesar temporarily changed his seal from a sphinx to Alexander's profile, again, as a way of giving a homage to Alexander the Great. And there's the one story that I love the best is at a time when Julius Caesar was still young, he realized that he was now as old as Alexander was when he died, but he had not yet conquered any land or territory. And it's said that when he realized that he had not yet done what Alexander had did, he wept. He was so distraught that he had accomplished so little when Alexander the Great had accomplished the world. Now, despite his fame, I want you to think and consider, was Alexander great? And as part of this, I want you to think, what is greatness and how is greatness defined? So let's do a quick recap. Following his conquest of Persia, Alexander went further east, moving into India, conquering the kingdom of Porus. He also found that his men refused to go any further, basically mutinying and insisting that they be allowed to go home. He tried to prove that he was the greatest man by taking his army through the Gedrosian desert, costing the lives of many of his men, but also earning the love and respect for those that survived. Back in Babylon, Alexander became sick, but nevertheless tried to keep the spirits of his men high by waving to them from the balcony. After his death, his empire dissolved very quickly because he had refused to name a successor to his kingdom. Nevertheless, Alexander's fame grew, and he went on to influence all of Greece, Rome, and, in fact, many rulers after that. He had essentially managed to conquer what he believed was the world before his death. Now, before we can move on, we need to make sure that you complete the final unit test and then complete the end of unit survey. Thank you, and we will have merch out soon.